Now that we've talked about transforming operators, and don't worry, there'll be a whole pile more. Now that we've talked about one example or two examples of transforming operators, let's talk about a different kind of operator that Flux offers, which is something that's called an action operator. And unlike transforming operators, whose purpose in life is to transform the values of the types that flow through the stream, the action operators don't modify anything, but instead use the values that they are given for side effects. And we're going to talk about two operators, doOnNext and doOnError. So let's talk about doOnNext first. What this operator does is it adds a behavior that's triggered whenever a Flux emits an item. And the behavior that will be processed whenever a Flux emits an item is passed as a consumer parameter that will be called if and only if the Flux emits an item successfully. So if it succeeds, if it does it successfully, then doOnNext will be called. And a consumer is an interesting functional interface defined in Java 8 and beyond, which has a method that's called back automatically in order to accept the item. So in other words, you can think of onNext as a callback. So it's going to get called back under certain circumstances. doOnNext is skipped if an unhandled error or exception occurs in the stream. So it won't process it in that case. What doOnNext returns is a Flux, all of whose values are the same as what it was given as input. So it doesn't make any changes. It makes no modifications whatsoever to the values. So here's a simple example that illustrates how you can use doOnNext. It's most commonly used for debugging or logging or just getting visibility into what's happening in a stream. So in this particular example, we're going to take a list of big fractions, turn it into a Flux of big fractions, and then for each of the big fractions in our Flux stream of big fractions, we're going to log them, and they'll be printed out somehow in a string builder or a string buffer or something like that. RxJava has exactly the same thing, works exactly the same way. And interestingly enough, Java Streams also has something very similar called peek. And peek is a method very much like doOnNext, which is just used to look at the values, again, for debugging or logging or whatever. And so here's an example where we can have 3 strings in a list. We turn into a stream, and then we print each of them out using peek before we uppercase them and then collect them into a list. The next operator is doOnError. And this is going to add a behavior that's triggered when a Flux completes with an error. So doOnNext is going to have its consumer called back when everything goes hunky-dory, when everything works fine. And as you might expect, things don't always work. So now we're going to have doOnError, and that's going to have a side effect whenever the Flux completes with an error. Once again, we have a consumer parameter that indicates what behavior we want to be called back on unsuccessful completion. That is also a callback, which intentionally has side effects. That's its purpose in life. And it returns a Flux that's not modified at all, just like doOnNext. So doOnError, doOnNext are these action operators that don't have any side effects. And so they only have side effects. They don't change the type or value of the elements at all. So here's an example, just for kicks. We're going to take our big fraction list, and we're going to turn it into a Flux stream. And then we're going to go ahead and take each big fraction and try to divide it by 0, which, of course, is not going to get us very far. It's going to blow up very quickly. And what will happen in that case is doOnError will be called, and then we will take the error that came through, which will be the exception, which will probably say something like arithmetic exception. That'll be the exception. And that's what we're going to end up logging. So you'll notice that doOnNext took a successful value that came through the Flux. doOnError takes an exception or error value that came through, and we're going to log that as well. RxJava, same thing, no change. And there's really nothing quite like this in the context of Java Streams. You can use peek, I suppose, to do that, although if an exception is thrown, peek is probably going to be skipped. So there's not something quite the same with Java Streams. Not that big of a deal in practice, but just be aware that there are some differences. So that's the end of our discussion of some of the key action operators in the Flux class. As with almost everything we're looking at here, whenever it says part 1, there's other operators in that category of operators in fluxes or monos or whatever that we'll talk about in later videos.